Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Probably the most notorious woman the Eastern Shore has ever known. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Patty Cannon lived along the Maryland-Delaware border, and along with her son-in-law Joe Johnson, she led a gang that sent African Americans south to be sold into slavery. She lived some 60 to 70 years and is believed to have been born somewhere around 1760. She died in 1829 after being arrested for murder. At the time, Delmarva held a mix of slaves and free blacks, and the Cannon gang took full advantage with forays into Baltimore and Philadelphia to obtain their merchandise. With us in the studio is Mindy Burgoyne. She is an author, travel writer, and conducts tours in the Eastern Shore, focusing on ghost stories that haunt the peninsula. And by phone is Michael Morgan. He is author of Delmarva's Patty Cannon, The Devil on the Nanticoke. He has written freelance articles for local newspapers on the history of Delmarva for around 3 decades. And welcome to the program, both of you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, Mindy, let me start out with you and give us a sense about what this area was like at the time, because, you know, now we have roads and all that kind of thing going on, but it was a pretty isolated place, particularly where Patty Cannon lived.
So you mean right at the
Yeah.
turn of the century, the 19th century? Well, you know, most of the travel was by either stagecoach, horse and cart, or the water. And there was little villages here and there. But it's people mostly lived out in the country. And it's interesting when you think about like how they worked with their money. You know, they didn't go to the bank and deposit it. You know, so if these farmers or plantation owners would amass this money, and oftentimes they would just bury it on their land. And the slave labor was definitely key to the economy. So you did have, you had the Underground Railroad also running right through here. So it was one of the places where there was a system to escape to the north because we were so close. So you still though had that sort of bubbling up of the arguing over the justification of slavery. That was just beginning. And we're so close to the border that in Maryland we certainly felt it, even though the peninsula is very isolated. So for somebody like Patty Cannon to be able to capture the free blacks, and there were a lot of free blacks, especially on the peninsula. You know, the Worcester County had a pretty big population, as did Somerset and Dorchester. I don't think Dorchester had as many, but it was easy. They had no voice in the community. There's nobody going to listen to them say somebody kidnapped me.
Right.
And so it was kind of a nice little business she had. She was right near the water, right near where there was a ferry, possibly owned by her relatives, and to snag somebody and use them as a commodity to sell was a lot of money.
I want to turn to you, Michael, and what do we know about her origins? I mean, obviously there was a lot of literature that was written afterwards suggesting she came from Canada and a whole elaborate background. What is it that we know about her origins?
The origins of Patty Cannon and the her lineage is really cloudy. There is a story that she came from Canada, but I kind of doubt it. I kind of think that she was a local girl who married into the Cannon family, and the Cannon family was here for 100, maybe 100 years before she. They're very early settlers of Sussex County, so it's not a whole lot known about her till she pops up in the contemporary records in terms of. Kidnapping of, as has been said, free African Americans, because the free African Americans had no voice. They couldn't testify against a white. Yet, if you kidnapped a slave, the slave owner would come after you because that was his property. So the free blacks were the most vulnerable people on the Eastern Shore.
Okay, one of the things, Michael, that you point out is that she's a grown woman somewhere around 1787, somewhere around there when the Constitution is written and ultimately ratified, and there's this beginning to close in terms of the importing of slaves. How does that particularly fit into her activities that then go on after that?
Well, basically, it increased the value of slaves or free blacks that already were here. As you said, there was in the American Revolution and the writing of the Constitution was a great time of change in terms of the status of people of color. For example, before the American Revolution, slavery was allowed in all of the colonies, not just in the South. But within 20 years after the Revolution, you get a pretty good division between the free and slave states. And Missouri Compromise in 1820 just sort of bore that out. So in that regard, there was sort of a ferreting out of the status of people, and basically Patty Cannon took advantage of that. For example, that if she kidnapped a half a dozen slaves, which was free blacks to sell them into slavery, and she chained them together and marched them down the road to the Nanticoke River to load them on a vessel to ship them south. That would not be unusual to see people of color being chained together and marched down the road because this was a slave area. So she could do this with impunity. The other thing was that whoever they captured were told not to reveal that they had been free, and the way they ensured this is that they would get an accomplice to stay with them for a little while, earn their confidence, and if they said that they were free, then they would report that to Cannon and her gang, and a beating would ensue, so that they quickly learned not to reveal that they were free, and that really was a key to them being able to transport themselves. And once you got into the Deep South, there was very, very little that they could do. You had no recourse. A person of color had no recourse to the legal system. You had to have a white person testify that they were free. So that made it really difficult once they were in the South.
Mindy, describe for me the structure of this family, and particularly there's a Johnson Tavern, obviously, that plays a significant role. What is the structure of this family? How are people relating to one another? Because there's a whole there's a southern is a son-in-law, and then of course there's her husband. Describe this family for me.
I don't know much about her husband.
Yeah.
There's suspicion
he kind of disappears.
that she might have poisoned him. But she had a daughter, and the daughter married Joe Johnson, and the obvious leaders of the gang were her and Joe Johnson. And so the tavern was there at that crossroads. Some people think the tavern was probably where that house is that has the marker in front of it. And her house was across the street. But the properties occupied 2 counties and 2 states. So they were on these borderlands. But Patty Cannon didn't just catch slaves. There was, the court records show a lot of debt not paid. She was just one of these people that did what she wanted and took advantage. At least it looks that way. I mean, who really knows, right? Because we don't have a personal account. But if you look at things that were people that she didn't pay that she owed money to, there was petty theft charges in the court records. Then there was all this talk about the kidnapping and selling down the river, and they were feared. I mean, there's U.S. Actually, when you look at the oral tradition, obviously it's gotten exaggerated.
Right.
But the fact that children would hear their parents say, "If you don't behave, Patty Cannon's going to come out and snatch you," and she was very, very feared, or that gang was feared. Now, my friend Hal Roth thinks that she got pegged wrong.
Bad rap.
That it was really Joe Johnson. But Joe Johnson, they did catch him for and put him to the pillory post and nailed his ears to it, and he took off and was never hurt. Probably Florida, and that was the end of that. Once they caught him and punished him and humiliated him, he left, and she stayed around. So, she was an older woman, when she died. It wasn't like she was young, so it's likely she wasn't out there pounding the pavement with catching free blacks and selling them. But she was hated. I mean, there's documents. There's an old document about Dorchester County where they understand that when you look at newspapers and things 100 years ago, they make the National Enquirer kind of look like the Bible. I mean, they had to sell, so it's very, very dramatic, and facts were not really that well considered. But there's a lot of inflammatory stuff about her. So it was probably a gang of people that went around and intimidated people and did what they wanted and victimized the weak. And we probably don't even know half of what that gang did.
It almost seems, from the descriptions I've seen and some, obviously, the characterizations that have come afterwards, she seemed almost as if she was psychopathic. She almost is like what we consider to be serial killers today, only she did all this stuff for money.
Or maybe sociopathic.
Or sociopath,
Maybe she just had no empathy for anyone. There's a story in I wish I knew if it was in a newspaper where I found that. I should have pulled it out. That says how she was caught. And it was she had a houseboy, an African-American young man, that they got a hold of, because a farmer had dug up some bones and thought, these are human, what's buried in this field. And they got the information out of him where other bones were buried, and even the bones of a child. And then some people speculated that child might have even been her grandchild. So definitely it's a possibility this woman was not empathetic, maybe sociopathic, just didn't have any idea how other people felt, did what she wanted, and got the money. I mean, money was definitely the goal. I mean, there's also with the bones that they dug up. I mean, I think there was the commentary from the young man was this was somebody that came to the tavern. This was not a slave catching, kidnapping or a free black kidnapping. This was a guy that came to the tavern that didn't have any family, and they robbed him, took his money, and murdered him. So I don't think that ever went to court, but those are the kinds of stories that were told about her and this gang of people that occupied Johnson's Corners, which they named after Joe Johnson.
Right.
And she was so hated that the people in the area had the town's name changed to Reliance just to dissociate itself with Patty Cannon and that gang.
Michael, you describe this incident which she allegedly kills, I guess it's a fellow named Rigel, and then tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. This was in 1813, and Ridgedale was a slave trader, and he stopped at Patty Cannon's house for dinner. I mean, as travelers were wont to do that. She discovered that he had some money, and as was said, that she would be on the lookout for anyone with money. So after dinner, he left, and she immediately got her son-in-law, who was Harry Brettington, and this was Mary Cannon's first husband, and two brothers, Jesse and John Griffith, and she got them together. She dressed in men's clothing, and she knew that Ridgedale was heading for Laurel. So she took a quicker route to be able to head him off and ambushed him. Shots were fired. He was mortally wounded. Ridgedale was mortally wounded, but he got away, and he got to Laurel, and where he died. But before he died, he described his assailants. Now, apparently, he did not implicate Patty. It may have been because she wore men's clothing at that ambush. At any rate, one of the brothers, Jesse, turned state's evidence and testified against the other two, and not Patty. They were convicted and executed at Georgetown. And apparently, there was executions at that time were public affairs, and strange as it seems, you'd pack a picnic lunch and go to town to see the hanging, and this was a double execution. That was a big thing. So there was a whole crowd of people coming into Georgetown, and Georgetown was not that old at that time. This was only 20 years old. So the sheriff sort of felt uneasy about having all these people come into town to see this execution. So he sent a word to Lewis, where this was in the middle of the War of 1812, and Lewis had just undergone a bombardment from the British, and the sheriff sent word to have a detachment of soldiers sent to Georgetown to keep order during that execution. And that happened, and apparently the execution went off without a hitch. But it's interesting, the documentation. When I've started doing my research on Patty Cannon, I kind of felt that a lot of this was legend, but I very quickly learned that there was a great deal of contemporary documentation for her activities. For example, the incident I just described is mentioned in Daniel Rodney's diary. Daniel Rodney would later be governor of Delaware, in two entries. So first, an entry that says they have requested troops for that execution, and then a couple of days later he notes that the execution was carried out. As far as Joe Johnson and Patty Cannon's activities, there was a abolitionist newspaper called the African Observer, who printed several letters and accounts of Johnson's kidnapping and taking to Mississippi a group of slaves, or a group of free people who were sold as slaves. Now, when he got there, the buyer was suspicious of these people that were purported to be slaves that he was selling, and eventually he called the sheriff, and the word got back to Delaware and eventually to Philadelphia, because there were a number of Philadelphians were disappearing. They particularly some chimney sweeps, and the mayor got involved, so that he sent a free person, or a white person, back to Mississippi, who was able to testify that these people of color were indeed free, and they were able to be released. So that's all in the contemporary newspaper, the African Observer, that describes these activities.
This place, both the tavern and the house, describe those for me because they almost seem very macabre. I mean, obviously you have shackles and so on, but seemed almost designed to keep people out of sight and chained away.
Well, I don't think we do have a picture of Patty Cannon's house long after she was gone, but I don't know that there's a picture of the tavern that I've seen anyway.
Yeah.
But these taverns, what a tavern was at the time, that's, you have to understand that people would be traveling on these roads by horseback or horse and carriage or some type of thing that would be a stagecoach type thing where somebody for hire carries people. And, these roads, you had to have a place to stop. And so you needed taverns, and taverns were big money makers. You'd eat there, you'd get out of the rain there. You might wait for another ride there, for some other person to come along. You might stay overnight there. So that's what this was. It was at a crossroads where all the counties kind of came together, Sussex, Dorchester, and Caroline. And it was a place that somebody like, a traveler would stop. So it probably, in 1812 or 1815 or 1820, 1790, it wouldn't have been a very attractive building. It would have been small with a few rooms, I would imagine, and a place to eat and get out of the rain. Patty's house, from the one picture that I've seen that survives, is just a farmhouse, and it was up in the field across the street from the tavern on the Sussex side. And it would have, I wouldn't think it would be remarkable. So she didn't live in any huge wealth, but shackles were not uncommon either in attics or also if you had a basement. One of the things I've seen on the ghost tours and doing the research with them is that's the thing that everybody says. There were shackles in the basement. They had chains rattling. It's almost urban legend where it's something that you feel like you must add to the story. There were shackles in the basement. But when in the rare case where there are basements here, sometimes shackles would have been for animals, that you would bring in out of the cold. And you didn't want them rattling around. So we don't necessarily know what they're used for. For slaves, the one thing that kind of misled people is that house that's where the tavern was, the man that owned it before the people that own it now, he really made a killing on marketing the Patty Cannon legend, and he put shackles up in the attic with mannequins, and so that when you drove by, you thought this is the Patty. And he led, and that's I think how people got confused thinking that that's where Patty Cannon's house was. But I don't imagine that these properties would have been very, very remarkable. But certainly she would have had some way to detain them. But honestly, a lot of times there were detainees held in the woods. They did find shackles on trees. So you take somebody down there and train them to a tree. Until the ferry came, or until you could take them on the next leg of that journey. So they didn't have to detain them in the houses.
Because I know that I think I was reading Michael's book that there were separate the upstairs. There would be separate stairways going upstairs and that kind of thing in her house. Are you familiar with that?
Well, back stairways are in a lot of houses. A lot of houses have a back stairway, but I wouldn't comment on that. Michael would be able to give you better info on that.
What about that, Michael? I mean, because as one of the ways, you indicate that was one of the ways that we're trying to figure out what was Patty Cannon's house. Describe that for me, if you could. Michael, are you there? Did we lose him? Okay, apparently we've lost him. We will try to get him back. So, what changed for the Cannon family? They have this incident with Rigel, and then they seem to shift. And if they find somebody, they just simply kill them. They just it's done. They're not going anywhere. There seems to be this sort of changing operation for them, and especially as you get a lot of free blacks, for instance, in Philadelphia and Baltimore and so on. That seems to be the area that clean, easy pickings, as it were.
Right. It certainly would be, but there was easy pickings here too, and we were in a time where there wasn't any telecommunications,
right?
So nobody taught. You didn't have this reporting so quickly, and even if you did in a newspaper, only people in the towns would see it. So it was easy to fly below the radar when you were dealing with an entity that had no voice around them that could come up and stand up against you. And I'm sure that they figured out that was easy to do, the easy way out. One thing that that Michael also made me think when he said is that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of blame in the commentary on Patty Cannon herself.
What do you think that is?
I don't know. I don't know, but I think that's what supports Hal Roth's theory that she was. It made better stories to sort of give her say that she was the one that was behind it all. She was the Ma Barker, so to speak. But that's it's all speculation. I'm not really a historian. I'm more of somebody who studies folklore. But I still can't believe. I just can't believe that with a little bit of facts that there are. I can't buy that.
Right.
Yeah.
Michael, let me ask you this. So this gang obviously comes to an end. How did they finally catch up with him? And the young man who ran across these bodies.
How did they catch up with Patty Cannon?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I didn't quite hear that.
Yeah. How did they finally catch up with her? I mean, she's going around, she's doing all these things, but
as she said earlier, they had a tenant farmer in one of her houses, and he was plowing in the field, and his horse sank to the haunches, and he started digging around and found human remains. And then they started digging some more and turned up additional remains, and this was sort of confirmation that what Patty had been up to. There was always rumors and innuendos and stories around Patty Cannon that the sheriffs and tried to confirm. Well, the human remains confirmed much of that. So she was arrested. She was taken to Georgetown jail. And then a week or two later, she was found dead in her jail cell. Some say she took poison. Some say she, just died of a heart attack or whatnot. We just don't know. But the fact is that she died in her jail cell, and that was the end of it. She was indicted before she died, and she was indicted for the murder of 3 infants. But obviously the trial never happened because of her death.
Now, after her death, we seem to get this sort of literary review and expansion on her life. Michael described that for us. There seems at least a couple of major publications or works that sort of expand her legend, as it were.
Right. About 12 years after her death, there was a book called The Narratives and Confessions of Patty Cannon that appeared. It did not get wide circulation. We do not know the authors of the book. It's a book it's more like a pamphlet about 20 pages long. It does repeat a lot of known facts about her. There is a story of her father coming from England and a noble family that was disowned, and not a very, very nice fella. He was a smuggler and a murderer and that kind of thing. There is no substantiation of that. So I kind of get that, put that down as literary license. And then about 40 years after that, right after the Civil War, George Alfred Townsend published The Entailed Hat, which is subtitled Patty Cannon's Time. And that, George Alfred Townsend was a novelist, and this was a novel. This is a work of fiction. But he also was a newspaper man and did some basic historic work. And at that time, the blend of history and in fact and fiction was done commonly. So it was and Townsend was born in Georgetown around 1840. So he was well familiar with the Patty Cannon legend. The book is still in print. It's excellent. A portrayal of the conditions of slavery and people of color. So it does have some basis in fact, but it is a work of fiction. So that he invents a lot of things in it. But I encourage anyone to read it. I mean, it's commonly available.
Mindy, I want to turn to the issue of the skull, which apparently you have seen. Tell us a little bit, and you have held it. So tell us, give us a little background on. I won't say what that says about anybody, but anyway, nonetheless, tell us a little bit about its background, but also, I mean, and how you came about to hold it.
Well, Hal told me about it. Hal Roth is an author who lives in Dorchester County. He's written a lot about local history and, folklore. And I heard the Patty Cannon skull was at the Dover Library, which just was so I figured I had to.
Gotta see it.
I called the Dover Library and talked to the director, and she said, well, yes, it is here, but you can't come and see it because there's a law in Delaware that says you can't have human remains on display. So we used to have it on display, but we had to take it down. So I can't show it to anybody. I can't be doing that. And I begged, and she finally said, all right, if you want to come down to my office, I will show it to you. And so I did. I went down into her office, and she, her office had bookshelves along the wall with books on them, and she walked over and pulled this little train case off of it and said, and I have some black fabric if you want to take a picture. And I thought, this is so weird. And she opened that little train case up, and out comes this skull, and the jaw pieces were kind of in a Ziploc because they'd fallen away. And right on the top of it, in pencil, was written Patty Cannon in cursive. And so then it had paperwork with it. So it had this documentation that said how it came to the Dover Library. And the way the document read was that there was a man who worked as a deputy sheriff, I guess, in Georgetown, where Patty Cannon died, and she was evidently put in a pauper's grave there. And they needed to put in a parking lot. And so they had to exhume these graves, and she was one of them. And the deputy said, they evidently knew knew who the bodies were.
Right.
And he asked if he could have the skull of Patty Cannon, and was granted that. And so he had it for years, like in his garage or his barn, People would come and look at it. And he talked about how he had the skull of Patty Cannon. And eventually, I can't remember if it was his son's generation or even a grandson's generation, but the skull, kind of got forgotten. And then the owner of it, either son or grandson, had to move away for health reasons. And the children of this person knew that he loved the library. He loved the Dover Library. And so they donated it to the Dover Library. And that's how it came to be there. But I called back later. I remember pulling that out thinking, I don't think I've ever in my life even seen a skull. I mean, maybe in the Smithsonian when you go look at the evolution display. But I've never, and here I'm seeing one that's supposed to be Patty Cannon, and I'm actually holding it. It was just very strange. They finally didn't know what to do with it. They needed to get it gone. They didn't own it.
Right.
But there weren't any heirs to give it back to. So they eventually got the Smithsonian to take it for the purposes of carbon dating it. So it's kind of loaned to them, like indefinitely. And I did have a conversation. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, because Michael, you write about how it almost sounds as if there might be two of these things floating around.
Right.
You just describe because there was an earlier thing that happened. Go ahead, describe that. Yeah.
The story of the Dover skull is as was explained is one line of the skull, but the authors of the narratives and confessions, Patty Cannon, mentioned that chronologists and people who believe that the feeling the bumps on the head indicate your personality traits, and had gotten hold of the skull. And in 1844, a fellow named O.S. Fowler, who was a leading phrenologist, published a work with a drawing of Patty Cannon's skull, indicating, some of her evil bumps, I guess. And in fact, there's a footnote in the Entailed Hat by Townsend that the skull was on display in a museum in New York. So, I don't think she had two heads.
So who knows whether they had the real one or not? You're a skeptic,
I'm skeptical of the Dover skull being Patty Cannon's, because of when they dug up the for the parking lot, they dug it up. Well, how did they identify that was her skull?
Mm-hmm.
So, and then we also have this line of the phrenologists having examined the skull, and where did they get that skull? So,
right, exactly. I mean, they may not have been the real one, I suppose. Okay, we're gonna.
So I'm skeptical of this.
Well, we'll leave that mystery there, and remind people we've been talking to Michael Morgan. He's author of Delmarva's Patty Cannon, The Devil on the Nanticoke, and also with Mindy Burgoyne. She is an author, travel writer, and conducts tours in the Eastern Shore, focusing on ghost stories that haunt Delmarva. And appreciate both of you stopping by and chatting with us.
Thank you.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, view the daily times, or visit pac14.org.